This is your basic 63 to 82 Corvette rear suspension. This particular frame that we're working on today is out of a 70 big block Corvette, hence the sway bar in it right here. What we're going to do is show you how to disassemble the suspension the easiest possible way. Depending on how old the car is how much difficulty with rusty bolts and such. But we will go through it step by step, showing you how to disassemble it safely and completely so that you'll be able to disassemble it yourself in your garage, backyard, wherever you might do it. You can see Art's there with a vice grip on the leaf spring. It's clamped on the second spring. We're going to, because it's on a hoist, use a pipe and a floor jack and jack up the spring. Whenever you disassemble a suspension, the smartest thing to do is take the pressure off the suspension, all the pivot joints, and you have to do this by removing the spring at these spring bolts. We'll set it all up and start up again with from at that point. As you can see, we've got the bar set up here on the floor jack, and we'll jack up the suspension and take the pressure off the spring bolt. This car happens to have poly bushings in it, and they've changed the spring bolt. It's just got a castle nut on it, actually an acorn nut on it. You'll have remove a carter pin and a castle nut on the standard Corvette suspension. If that nut is rusted on there, you'll have to cut it off. Hopefully that won't happen, because that could be a real pain. As you can see how nice and clean and neat this is. There's no exhaust system or tire tub in there. Yours will have that in there, and it'll make it a little crowded. We've done this so that you can see everything that's going on and you don't have any interference with all that other stuff. We're going to get this, we're going to take the pressure off the spring here now by dropping the jack down, and then we'll set the suspension into ride height position without the spring on it with a socket in the frame. We'll show you that. By doing that, it takes all the pressure off all the pivot joints, the half shafts, the strut rods, and it makes it much easier to disassemble it. Okay, you can see the spring is disconnected. We also disconnected the sway bar. We lifted the trailing arm up and inserted a socket between the lower part of the frame and the bottom of the T-arm. What this does is it levels everything to ride height. You see that the half shaft is almost straight across. That means that all the weight or all the tension is off the suspension now, and it'll be much easier to disassemble. You want to go across here. Art's got the right side set to be disassembled. We have to do that because we can't get the wrench up in here. Put a vice grip on the bolt there, because the wrench won't go in the T-arm cavity because of the sway bar bolt being there. Art's got the bolt loose here and the cushion off, and he's going to release the jack now. You must remember that when you're doing this, that everything's got to be just lined up perfectly. If you got it off to one side, that jack can slip off that vice grip and things can happen, because there's lots of pressure on that. Art's going to go and get a socket here now, and he's going to lift up the A-arm here and stick another socket. We're using 9/16 sockets in the frame here, so that they tend to be the diameter that's most applicable to the ride height of the car. How was that? Now you can see the socket in place again. Now we're going to begin or continue the disassembly of the suspension. There's no specific order, but we usually take the strut rods off here, undo the shock here, we remove the shock, then the shock mount, pull the sway bar down, and then for trailing arms we take the half shaft off and we leave the other end of the half shaft in the car. If you have French locks on your car, get some light here, the locating tab, or the tabs have to be bent back. You can see the one there. And then a 5/8 6-point socket has to be used to get them off. Okay, Art's removing the shock mount nut, which is 15/16 on both sides. We then remove the shock mount nut itself. Which is 3/4. And then Art will take the screwdriver used to adjust carburetors with. Prise the shock off. Now the next step is critical. We're going to get a shock mount remover tool, install it so you can see how it works, and use it to drive the shock mounts off. Okay, this is the shock mount tool, and we're turning it on the end of the shock mount and bottoming out inside. What this does is it protects the shock mount from damage when we're driving the shock mount out. These things are about 35 bucks a piece new. How many? 45. Oh, price increase to 45 bucks. Oh, there you go. You can see it move here. I'll zoom in here. See it's flipping finger. There it is right there. How much it's moving. We'll back the shock mount driver off. Again. Again, again, again. Now, I'm going to give you a little tip here. If you're driving a real hard shock mount that's rusted in place, what we do is we back off the shock mount tool and we install a small nut inside it and then tighten that back down on top of the shock mount. What you're doing is removing any free play in there so that it will not tear the threads up in the shock mount tool. Just putting the other side in, we'll zoom into that. Oh, we're going to try to get them, take a punch and knock it the rest of the way through on the ground, and the strut rod falls out. Now these things are falling out fairly easily because somebody's had poly suspension put in this car. We're restoring this car back to original. It's a 1974 54 4-speed with air, and we're going to put all the original bushings back in it. Plus we're going to restore the car to its original condition. yeah, we use crescent wrenches too. Yeah, they're coming out real easy. Sometimes you have to really wail on them to get them out. Oops, there we go. Alright, next to the half shafts. You can see that tab there, it's going to knock that flat so we can get the socket on. If you have those tabs, they have to be knocked flat. It's a great debate on how many of these tabs are folded over. You can see the one on the top isn't folded over. Sometimes you get them with both of them folded over, sometimes just the one. It sticks a screwdriver in the rotor and rotates the assembly. To remove the half shaft, we strongly recommend a 6-point socket. And usually an impact socket, which is the heavier style, won't fit in this area. This one here happens to be an impact socket, but what we've done is we've machined down the end of it so it will fit inside the radius of Now that one's a tight one. A 12-point socket would have torn the nut up. It's never happened to us, mind you, so... And we get all the customers in here that have done it and can't get the darn thing off after that, so they bring it here. So another good one. We're going to luck out all four. Yeah. Now you see how everything's still in place? With that suspension sitting in a ride height, it's a much nicer assembly. And there it is, it's disconnected. If you had that thing hanging down, it would be almost, well, it's a real chore to get it back together again by hanging it. That socket's worth it's got to be worth $50. Please send your money in. We'll get the other side off and then begin to take the trailing arm. Well, we've got to take the rotor and the caliper off anyway. We'll get back at that in a minute. To remove the caliper, clamp off the brake hose. Now, to do that, you've got to be careful. If it's an older hose, a good chance is that it's probably going to have to be replaced. If it's fairly pliable, just clamp it enough to squash it closed. Don't clamp it so you're mushing it all out. If you do, it just cause you damage you don't need to get into. The next thing we're going to do is remove the brake line. A lot of times this brake line is going to be rusted so bad, you're better off just to cut it off there and back here at the caliper, and then remove the line. And then we have to get at the caliper mount bolts, which one's there and the other one is right there. When we remove the line, they'll be very accessible. With the brake line removed, the caliper the bolts are very accessible. This sway bar doesn't help too much, but it's still accessible through that little niche there. The top one is easily attainable. Alright, with both bolts removed, what we do is we take a piece of wood as we're lifting the caliper out and stick it between the brake pads. And what this does is it keeps the pads apart so that when you put it back in the car it's a little easier, and because they're spring loaded it helps them stay in place so that it doesn't pop the seals, especially on older calipers. Now the next thing is the rotor comes off. You should make sure that you remember the location, mark it somehow with, I think, is this one marked? It's marked, so that you put it back on the same spot. If you don't, you run into the problem of pumping the rotor not running true, etc., causing getting air in the system through the caliper pistons. Art's going to remove the emergency brake cable, just a slight little twist and pop, it's off. If only it was that easy to put back on. And that's another story all in itself. Art's taking the Mickey Mouse, I wish I could work that properly, Mickey Mouse clip off and removing the cable. That looks easy, doesn't it? Just wait till you get a rusty puppy. Art has to remove the C-clip from the brake hose. Thusly, and remove the brake hose from the T-arm. Now that we got all the easy stuff done, we've got to remove this trailing arm bolt. I'm losing my focus. In the car, this is kind of tucked in between the fender panel cavity, and yeah, it's shrouded like that. At least, but their nails aren't clipped like that. And we have to drive it in towards the car. These should come out okay. This car is in pretty nice shape. And that's 11/16 wrench. In most cases, or a lot of the cases, this bolt that we have running through the trailing arm seizes in the T-arm bushing sleeve. What that requires you to do is one of two things. If it is seized, you either have to torch it in half on either side of the trailing arm, or you have to get a Sawzall or that type of tool and cut it. That would require you to remove the shims, which we'll show you as we take them out. The alignment shims. I'm afraid to zoom this in there. I don't think you can see the shims there. A thick one, a medium one, and a thin one on the inside. And this one here is a thick one and a thin one on the outside. This carved pin that Art just removed is a pin to retain the shims in the T-arm cavity, frame cavity. Oh, wasn't that nice? Art just slipped those shims out. This minute, Art's pulling out the inside T-arm. I'm going to tell you guys that that was easy. Usually we take a long bar in the area 4 feet long. We've got it tapered down into a semi point that fits in the hole of the shim, and we usually whale on it and reef on it trying to get it out. And I'll show you how to drive that pin out. Now we use a long drift like this, an old piece of axle shaft. On the end of it, it's got a small hole drilled in it, and we set that on the end of the bolt. Now when you do this, you're going to have interference with the quarter panel, so you're going to have to come in at a bit of an angle with it. So you set it in there like that, and you drive the bolt in like that. I'd say 8 out of 10 times that doesn't happen. Now because we've got the body off the frame, I'm going to take you to the back side as if you were the floor pan, and we'll see how that bolt's come through and where it's going into that cavity. This is our bar. You can see it's tapered at one end that we used to pull the shims out with, and bar speak with forked tongue at the other end. And Art's going to insert that as if he was underneath the car, and I'll zoom in here to show you what's happening. You can see him. And now you've got to get the get there, and that. Now go to the other side of the. You got to watch the fuel lines that are there. Just have to be careful. Even as easily as it is to do the way we've got it set up, it's still a bit of a problem. There it is. It's out. And the trailing arm assembly is in your hands. Or if you're underneath it, when it lets go, it's on your head. Alright, and that's it. Then you send it in to us and we look after the rest of it. And you're done with that for the rest of your life. For as long as you own the car anyway. Alright, now if you're only taking off the bearing assembly, what you have to do is you're going to have to bend the brake line a bit, but be careful you don't kink it. And bend it away in here so that you get at the bolt, the caliper mount bolt there, and bend it up there so you can get in access to the caliper mount bolt there. Now the reason you're doing this is you're going to lift the caliper off with the brake line still intact, and we're going to hook it onto the frame with a screwdriver. This way you don't lose your prime on the brakes, so that you can drop everything back on in place when the bearing assembly is rebuilt. So we get the bolts off and then we'll set the caliper in place. We've removed the caliper mount bolts, and as you can see we've also clamped the line off. Now, contrary to the way we took the other one off, because you've got this line clamped off, when we lift the caliper up, because it's still all connected, the pistons will not move, or very slightly. So when we lift it off, up it goes. Screwdriver through the front of the front mount bolt and into the rebound rubber bracket. And we'll stand back, and there it is. It's all separated for you. Remove the rotor, making sure as you remember to mark it so you know what spot it goes into. Remove the emergency brake cable. You have to remove the brake shoes. When you do that, there's 4 9/16 nuts, 9/16 head nuts. Remove the upper spring. Most of the older cars, lots of miles on, never been done, that spring probably won't be there any longer. Now the upper part of the shoes are separated, and we get in there with a pair of needle nose. We have to try to get the spring off, the mounting springs off on each. There's one on each shoe, front and back. Oh, look at that, I already got it first time. Usually it takes us an hour. No, we're a little better than that. Okay. On the front one, you can reach the pin on the back when you stick your finger through the vent hole in the dust shield and hold it in place, and it's much easier. The back one, it doesn't have that. You don't have the ability because it's in a sealed cavity in the caliper mount bracket. Pull the shoes down and they're all free and intact. Oh, and they're stainless steel too. Somebody was spending some money. There's 2 of the 4 mounting bolts. We'll remove those. And you also have to remove this flange nut and the flange. It's not pressed on. You just remove the nut and slip the flange off. And we'll come back to it when we get to that spot. Now you're probably asking yourself, how do I get that big nut off the back because all this stuff's off? See that big hole there? Stick a bolt through it. We're using a 7/16 bolt and jam it against the brake pivot. We're going to turn the nut this way, so it's going to come this way. I'll come around here. The socket's on it. Okay. Now that's in there tight. They're about 110 pounds torque. Well, I don't think it's going to be that easy to come off. But and when you put it back on, you take the bolt out and slide it in the other way when you torque it back on. And that's got to be worth another $20 in tip. You can do it by yourself. You have somebody with a big bar between the wheel studs. Okay, the nut's off, and then Art will pull the flange off, and as you'll see, it just comes right off. As easy as that. Now, the caliper mount bracket is ready to, or caliper assembly, I'm sorry. There's no, the bearing support. It's ready to come on. Now what we do here is we take a pickle fork if it's a little stiff, and we wedge it in this cavity here that I'm showing you. Pickle fork is what they use to take ball joints and stuff off with. Or you can get some kind of a wedge, but we want to wedge it in that spot, that cavity right there. Start to separate it. There you go, popped it off. And that should come right out. Bingo. There's your bearing assembly. Send that to us and we'll give it back to you in A1 number 1 shape. So you can see it now. T-arm is still in the car. Caliper is hung on the frame. We'll rebuild that thing for you, come back and just reverse the procedure, but we'll get into that when we put this thing all back together again. If you want to take the sway bar or the strut rods out, you have to undo this nut here and drive this pin out, or bolt out here. Again, lots of times on the older cars it'll rust through here and it'll almost be impossible to drive this out. If that happens, there's 4 9/16 head bolts into the bottom of the differential. Undo the entire plate and drop it out of the car. You have much better access to it and it's easier to work with. Okay, we'll remove the spring just for clarity. Tap out the bolt. Now this is critical. When you pull this thing out, there's got to be those, you see 2 reducing washers. They must go back in. If you don't, the thing will move around in there and cause you all kinds of problems. They're in there to take up the space that of the bracket, and they've got to go back in. We're going to disassemble the front suspension. This is what it looks like with the body off the car, and it's considerably easier to do than with it on the car. The biggest problem that we usually have is these studs here. They have to be slide hammered out. They're pressed fit like a wheel stud into a rotor, and they have to be knocked out so that you can remove the A-arm and we then pull the A-arm through the fender panel, and it's out of the car, and it's got to be reassembled the same way. So we'll get knocking this thing apart and film it step by step to show you the procedure that we use to get it off the car. Here we've got the top bolts off, nuts off, and we've got the shim stacks here that have to be removed. They've got to be removed in such a way as you don't lose them. This car here looks pretty good. The shim stack is small. Some cars we've seen with over an inch of shim stacked in there. That means there's problems somewhere, and you should probably look for it. See if you can find a bent frame or badly worn parts that they've compensated with shims to correct the alignment in the front end. Let's go to the other side here. Take a screwdriver just behind the stud there, gently pry it apart, and pull the shim stack out. That's all there is to it. We put the front shim stack on top of the air cleaner in the front, and we put the back shim stack in the back of the air cleaner. That's all there is to it. Then what we do is we undo the shock, and then we go up in the air, start disassembling the rest of the suspension. And we'll get at that next. Alright, the next thing we do is remove the carter pins all the way around. Upper and lower ball joints and the outer tie rod end. Right here. Remove that. Then we'll come around here. We'll undo the sway bar, undo the shock absorber, and then we'll take the caliper off. We will not disconnect it though. We'll just let it hang there until we get the suspension apart, and then we you can take a coat hanger or what have you and wire it to the frame to keep the pressure off the brake hose itself after the suspension is all gone or removed. Okay, we've removed all the castle nuts from the tie rod end, lower ball joint, and the upper ball joint. Now you see that we haven't taken it completely off, and the threads are just below the notches in the nut. And what we do is leave that one on there. That is critical. We'll show you why, because when we break the suspension we need some control when it comes apart, because it's under a lot of tension with these springs. And that will catch the suspension and stop it from exploding apart and having springs and things flying. And we'll show you that in a second. We've got to remove the caliper, and then we're ready. You see the sway bar unhooked there. The shock is out. Okay, let's get ready. Alright, here it is set in place. This could be on your garage floor, and even on a hoist in the shop we do it this way. Jack is underneath the spring perch where the shock goes through. The caliper is now ready to be removed. Don't forget your little stick to hold the pads apart. Make sure you use a 6-point socket removing those nuts. They can be hard to get off. Now we just let that thing lay there like that for the time being. Now this is where you've got to hit it. There's a little locator pad right there. You hit that with a hammer. We're going to endeavor to try to do that. We're going to endeavor to try and hit that pad right there and separate the suspension. 1, 2, 3. There it goes. Now see it separated? Now I take a 3/4 inch wrench and remove the nut. Alright, being a big block, believe it or not, the springs are shorter and fatter and don't offer as quite an explosive power a small block spring does. Now what we're going to do is undo the jack. Well, we're going to have to raise the hoist. But now you see you've got separation. Alright, Art's going to remove the caliper. Take it back, and we have a hook that we use. We just hook it in there any old way we can and hook it into a hole in the frame. Okay, Art, do you want to jack it up?
You just get it off? Oh, we can't. We should get the tie rod first, right?
Yeah, we goofed. We should have removed the tie rod. We'll do that right now, but the tie rod should be removed first. Alright, we're going to remove the tie rod end, and you hit it right basically there. Make sure you remove your finger before you hit it. Bingo. Now if you've watched this tape in its entirety before you've tried to take it apart, do the tie rod end first and then the upper ball joint. Now we're going to have to raise it up in the hoist to get separation. We're going to remove the lower ball joint now that the pressure's off the top ball joint, hitting it at that spot there. Bingo. Remove your spindle assembly, and that side's done. Now what we're going to do is raise the car easily. There it goes, there it goes. Alright, most of the pressure's off the suspension, and this rebound rubber will act as a bit of a buffer zone too when you remove the spring. It'll help control the Now that looks really easy, doesn't it? If you've got small block cars, that spring could come out of there with a little bit of force, so just be a little more careful than that. Like I said, the big block springs are shorter and fatter and are much easier to install. Alright, now let's go to you're still with the car on the car is on the chassis, and we've got to remove those bolts that we talked about earlier. I'm going to tell you guys, this upper bolt's already loose, so we take a slide hammer like this through the fender panel in the car, and there you go. That's what we do. This one here is tight. There it goes. Okay, then you lift the A-arm up and pull the bolts out. There you go. And then you pull it out of the fender panel. It's a little tight wiggling it in and out of the fender panel, but it can be done without doing any damage. Now we'll raise the chassis in the air to give you a better look at the lower A-arm and how we disconnect it. This particular car has poly bushings in it, so the A-arms move quite freely. What we recommend is that you loosen these nuts off here. There's two here, and there's two on the upper A-arms. If you're in like a 70s and up car, it's very difficult to get the front one loose because the rad cradle or the shroud and everything is in the way. But anyway, that'll help you a bit. It'll take some of the pressures off the bushings. There's 3 bolts on here. Back one, a 7/8 socket, as you can see. There's 2 5/8 bolts in the front. We're going to lift this up so that we get it out of the way so we can get access to that bolt. We did it that way to show you what it looks like. If you're under the car, this is what it looks like. that loud enough. Now I get a 5/8. Again, use a 6-point socket. Get ready to catch the A-arm. Sometimes that back bolt will rust in the cross shaft. You might have to spray it with some penetrating fluid and wiggle it out, but usually they come out fairly easily. Alright, there's the passenger side strip clean. This is what it looks like before. Remember, undo the tie rod first. We did it second, but it would make it easier. We'd be able to work it better. Undo the tie rod first. The nut on there is 11/16. Upper ball joint is 3/4. The lower one is 7/8. The nuts on there. Sometimes that tie rod end can be 5/8 also. But there it is, completed or ready to be disassembled. Alright, this is the entire suspension of this particular Corvette that we're building. It's a little more than what we're going to or anticipated getting into in regards to the video we're doing, but it shows you the layout of all the parts that are required to put the suspension together. An added feature here today is we're going to show you how to stick a differential in the car. The easiest way that we've found to do it, we've seen a number of people try it different ways, and this way here is probably the easiest, we think anyway, and that's how we do it here. So we'll leave it up to your judgment when you see us stick it in. I'll get down off the ladder here and I'll show you a closer view of all the stuff that we've got here laid out ready to be installed. This is the differential. It's equipped with 336 gears. This particular unit is a heavy-duty unit because of these straps here, and not the U-bolts that you see here that go on the drive shaft. There you go. It's usually the high horsepower cars and big blocks all get these clamp style brackets on the differential. It's a trailing arm assembly, T-arm bolts. I just realized that I didn't put a shim package in the front for the T-arm bolt, or just to align it. I better stop the film and get some. Okay, we're back. Now there's the shims. They're stacked on either side of the trailing arm when it's in the car to get the right toe in. Just go over to a white spot in the carpet. These are the three different thicknesses of the shims. The thin one, the medium one, which is twice as thick as the thin one, and the thick one, which is about 3 times as thick as the thin one. When you take the T-arm out of the car, make sure you make a note where these shims are placed on either side of the trailing arm. That way you can put them back into the car the same way, and that alignment should be just about right on. Okay, let's go to the rest of the suspension here. This car has a sway bar in it. We'll get to that in a minute. The half shafts are bolted back to the trailing arm with these French locks here. Strut rods. These washers here are critical when you put the strut rod back in the car. They must be in there, and they go on either side of that bushing, and then they're inserted into this plate that's bolted to the differential, and then the adjuster bolt goes through it. These things have to be in there. If they're not, the strut rod will move around in there and cause you all kinds of grief. Leaf spring. Spring's been rebuilt with new liners, painted gray, roughly to match the color of the original spring. Here's the sway bar. Now these brackets here and plates, they go in the back of the trailing arm right there. You put the cushion in it and then the spring bolt, and then you put this this plate here in. You take that plate and put it on top of the trailing arm and screw it down. Then you take that lever, put it in there with a bolt, and then this sway bar is bolted onto the frame, and that bolt there goes through that part of the lever. I'll do a slow walk around. Looks like a mess of little things, but really it doesn't take a whole length of time to get this in the car. We'll show you a few tricks to put it into the car. And hopefully it'll make the job easier for you. All I have to do is wait for Art to show up, and then we can get at this. Alright, this is the chassis we're going to use to install all the rear suspension in. There's pros and cons doing it this way, but we felt that if we did it this way, it would be easier for you to see from the bird's eye view of how it's all done and how we do things. And being able to look down through it, you can see how it comes through from a different perspective, which should help you assemble your car or rear suspension, depending on how far you get into it. Try and stick this in. pretty much it. We'll just put the bolts in here, tighten up the pinion, and the differential's in the car. The rest of the suspension follows after that. Alright, we're going to stick the T-arm bolt in first, and we use these kind of pliers. Hopefully you can see that all in the frame. How about that way? They're long, and we can take the bolt. Remember, you're doing this from the other side, but this is what it's going to kind of look like. Bring it in like that. We've greased the bolt. And then get it in the hole. If you don't have pliers like that, you can stick it in here with your fingers thusly to get it in. And there's this brake lines here, and there's another block that goes in here. It makes it a little more difficult. But what we'll do now is we'll stick the trailing arm in and show you how that goes. Okay, here's the other angle. You can see the bolt there. It's sticking through the frame, about a ½ inch. We'll take the trailing arm and insert it in as close to this side of the frame as possible, slide it up to the bolt so we get it lined up in the bushing hole, and then we'll take the pliers that we showed you, but you probably didn't get a good look at them. I'll show you now. There they are there. They're kind of long, but anything you can get in there with to grab that bolt and slide it in will work. It's going to be difficult for me to film this and do it at the same time, so I'll get it in place and give you and show you what we've done. Okay, there's the trailing arm installed with the bolt partially in. I'll just go around the other side and show you what it looks like from the back side. Alright, now we're going to try and stick that bolt through there and have it come out here. Alright, now you see the bolt all the way through the frame. The next thing we do is we install this 9/16 socket under the trailing arm between the frame. It sets the trailing arm at ride height, and it makes for easier installation of all the other stuff that's got to go on. I'll show you that in a minute. There's the socket I was telling you about. What we're also going to do is we take the trailing arm and we push it all the way to the inside of the frame. And what that does is allow us to put the half shaft in without having to fight with it too much, getting the bolts lined up and so forth. There it is. Okay, we'll put the half shaft on now. Alright, see the half shaft installed. High horsepower clamps on the differential. These are French locks here. And I always bend one tab. Somebody says you got to bend two on each one. I just bend one. Wherever the flat of the bolt lines up with the tab, then that's the one that gets bent. Locks it in place. Next thing is the sway bar and the sway bar bracket. I'll stick that in right away. Okay, here's the sway bar partially installed in the bracket and dip. I'll zoom on those little washers. You see them there with the teeth? Well, that's the bushing, but you can see the washer installed, and you have to put those in. That strut rod will flop around in there. And now we'll grease the adjusting bolt and stick it in there and fix that up, and then we'll put the sway bar onto the trailing arm.
That way?
So, turn it. The shock mount bolt's got a flat cut in it, and it fits in the flat that's right there. I'll get Art just to stick it in for you. There's a left and right bolt. You see the level it's at? And it can't turn. I'll pull that out, stick the strut rod in place. Sometimes you have to get a screwdriver and align the hole up a little bit, but we'll do that and get back. Alright, we've got it inserted. There it is. Now you can put your nut on there and you can torque it in place because you've got that socket in this frame, and that means that the suspension's at ride height. All bushings must be tightened at ride height. If you tighten them when the suspension's hanging, they'll tear the bushing out later on, or very quickly, a premature failure. It's almost like those Indian rope burrs we used to give each other when we were kids. So what it does to the bearing, or the bushing rather, it'll tear it out. So you tighten this one up, and you tighten that one up. Art's going to get this one tight on the outside. We'll show you how to do a poor man's alignment in two short seconds here. A little trivia, the capsule nut's installed, and you see the Carter pin in place, but the Carter pin's upside down. The reason for that is when the factory built these frames, the frames were upside down on the assembly line when they went past these guys putting the stuff in, and they dropped it from the top, which obviously looks like it's upside down when the car is right side up. Now if you can figure that out, write me a letter and tell me. Alright, here's the first adjustment we make with the camber bolt. We take a long straight edge and we place it on the spindle flange like that. Very simple. You go up to the top. You see the bubble? There. See him move it in it? There it goes. You just bit more, bit more, bit more, bit more. Good, good. Camber adjustment's done. Tighten the bolts up in place. Adjust it by these bolts here in the eccentrics. All we do is we just tighten it up. Once it's tight, you recheck it to make sure it's there, and you're done for that side. Now, we'll show you how to do the toe-in adjustment. It's not a fail-safe adjustment. What it does is it allows you to get the car to the alignment shop and have it done professionally. We'll show you how to do that right away. Alright, we take our long level, and as you can see, it's not touching the frame at the back, but it's touching up front. Now what we want to do is we want to have the same measurement at the front of the level as at the back of the level. So what we do is we start to push the T-arm out. We start to push the T-arm out. See the space? Okay, that's good. Now what we do is we measure up the end, up at either end, and then we stick the appropriate shims in the cavity here, and your alignment's semi-done. Now this will allow you to get the car to the alignment shop and have them finish it up properly with the gauges. And that's basically all there is to it. That tip alone's worth 20 bucks for the price of the tape. Okay. You can see the shims stacked in there. Looks like we've got a thick one, two thin ones, and a medium one, and one thick one. Just a little information: when you're putting a shock in, the lock washer goes on the outside against the head of the bolt. If you put it on the inside, the nut will tend to rub against the body of the car. It's never happened to us, but... Okay, we're getting ready to put the spring in. Just because the spring is all detailed, we've clamped it with a piece of cardboard. We put a jack underneath it, and we'll jack the spring up into place. You can see the bolt and cushion and the washer and the nut sitting there. The problem we've got is that there's no body on this car, so we've got about 5 guys standing behind me ready to jump on this thing so that we can get it in place. So it should be proved to be interesting. I'll show you when we get it finished. Alright, there's the spring in place with the cushion. We're showing in this bolt because the original bolts in these things come with a shoulder on them. And what you want to do is you want to run the nut, this here, up just so that you can get the Carter pin in the hole. A lot of guys take an impact gun and run the nut up against the shoulder on the bolt. And once you do that, it's almost impossible to get it off again without cutting a
things apart. One other tip, if you've got a convertible, these bolts are about 3/4 of an inch shorter than the coupe bolts. Don't lose them. They do not make them, and they're almost impossible to find. If you have to use a longer bolt, it'll make the car sit lower. There's another $20 tip. Okay, here we go. All finished. We'll take a picture from the top side of the car. If we were in a rush to do this, it would probably take us about an hour to put the whole suspension back in the car. Granted, we haven't got the brake lines on and the calipers and the emergency cables, but you've got the general idea of what has to be done, and now you should be able to do it. They want me to tell you about these washers on the shocks. They're concave, and they should be installed this way, I'm told, although we argue about it all the time. Okay, I mentioned it.
Here's a picture of the front suspension, all done, ready to be put back in the car. Ball joints, bushings, all the parts are detailed, cleaned. What we haven't shown you here is the steering box isn't finished yet. We've got the power steering ram and the hoses that have to go in here yet. This may be a better shot of it. Okay, let's go put it back on the car. Putting the suspension back in the car, these bolts here must be left loose so that you're able to slide the A-arm down in between here, because if you don't, you won't be able to get the A-arm in. Unfortunately, we don't have the rad in the car at the moment, which just shrouds the area even more. It'll make it easy for us to do it, but when you're putting it in the car, that's going to be a little more difficult. You just have to insert the A-arm between the fender panel opening and just wiggle it in there any way you can. Sometimes we pull the lip that comes down here, we pull it back and then set the A-arm into the place. I'll go and set the A-arm in place and start doing the bolts up and show you what that looks like. Through the fender panel, you've got to reach in with a bar and then reseat those bolts that we're talking about to hold the A-arm on. Okay. Back one. Alright, now you're ready to do them up. Alright, here's the upper A-frame. With the A-arm installed, we use 3 shims in the back and 2 in the front to start with. When you take your A-arms out, you should have located the front and rear shims in a safe spot, so when you put them back in, you put the same ones back in the right location. These bolts here on the bushings, you leave them loose until the car's back on the ground, and you push around a little bit, and then you tighten these up. I suggest that you snug them up a little bit in the car, or before you put them in the car, so that it'll be won't be as tedious trying to get them all done up later with the fan shroud in the way. This shaft's bent too.
That one is.
Right. To set your spring in the car, this end of the spring has to sit just back of this hole here. This is here. Sideways, and it should sit in the car like that. When it's sitting in there like that, this one will sit also in the top of the frame in the same spot. Now we'll show you how to set the spring in place the different springs are at different degrees of difficulty. Generally the big block springs are easier to put in because they're much shorter, but they're thicker. So we like doing big block springs as opposed to small blocks, because the small blocks are longer and they're thinner and they're a little tougher to put in. So we'll go over to the suspension right now and do it. Okay. Got a jack underneath the A-arm, and we've got one of the tabs of the jack on the embossed area so it won't slide back. We've got the spring set into place up here in the frame, and we've got the end of the spring lined up to the spot we just showed you. It's just got to turn it back just a little bit. What we'll do is we'll start to jack the spring up in the car, and it'll want to come out this way. What we'll do is we get our bar in here, put our foot on here, and we get it up to a right height. We just kick it and it'll go right in. Hopefully. Okay, jack it up. Okay, hold it there. Now, we've got it just about vertical, and we just push it and bend it. That's it. Now that's very easy to do. These big blocks, as I said before, are very easy to do. Okay, keep jacking it up. I want to just check in the back of the frame to make sure it hasn't popped out on the top. Yeah, it's in. Now again, because we've got the body off the car, this may be a little difficult, because it may start to jack the chassis up. And we'll have to get some weight in here to... All the spring is doing is finding its seat. It's just starting to move. Alright, Sean, that's good. Alright, now I take your spindle assembly, put it on the bottom first. Alright. In the car it's a lot easier because you can squeeze things down with the weight of the car on. Set that one in place. Put your upper ball joint nut on. I like to tighten the top one up first with the pressure still on the suspension. That's way that there's no pressure on the bolt pulling it down. So we'll just set that place. Line up your pinhole. Now what we do now is we release the jack, and the spring will push the ball joint down in it and seat itself into the lower part of the spindle. Okay. Do that up by hand. All there is to it. Okay, the front suspension is together, the shock is in, the rebound rubber. We forgot to mention this. This rebound rubber, you should leave that off until the spring is in, because it's difficult to get that spring over top that rebound rubber, or if you leave it on when you're doing it, you're going to end up tearing the bumper. So take that off. We haven't put the sway bar on them because jack stands are right in the way, and we'll put that on later. But for the most part, there's the front suspension done. We'll hook up the steering linkage and all that stuff once we get the steering box done and the idler put in, and the rest of that stuff back from the rebuilder, and then we'll take a shot of that for you. Here you'll see the front suspension completely assembled in the chassis. Excuse my wooden prop to hold the hose up. We're going to run the motor for you too as a little added bonus. We'll go and take a shot from behind so you can see what it looks from behind. Looks like from behind. Alright, we'll do the rear suspension. See if we can get a shot of the shims in there. You can just see a bit of it. There they are there. Go across the frame to the other side. There's a good shot of them there. Let's get the exhaust out of the way. The other side. Here's a shock and strut rod assembly. French locks there. Down here. I like putting the washers up this way because they don't hang below the bracket and you can't see them when the car is all back together again and on the ground. If you do it the other way, you can see these things hanging down. Let's start the alignment because everything has been apart. We've put 3 shims in the back and 2 in the front on both sides, and then when we get aligned, the alignment guys will change them as they see fit. We put the Zerk fitting on the grease, on the ball joint for greasing. We put it at the back so road dirt and stuff coming at it won't tend to plug it up and get it too gunky. Sway bar installation. We put a bar between the sway bar here and over to the edge of the frame here and push it down to get this last bushing in, especially with the new link kits because the bushings are real fat, but now that you got the original ones, then they should be okay. This goes on after the spring goes in, as we said before, the rebound snubber, so that you don't tear it putting the spring in. As you can see, Be tough to get the spring in with that thing sticking in the way. That pretty much does it for the suspension installation. Now for your enjoyment, we'll fire this thing up. So you can see we're pumping water into the upper intake manifold. We have the intake to the water pump hooked up, and we have a drain off the bottom of the water pump over to the drain there. You turn the water on and pump all the, keep it cool. It'll warm up to the thermostat setting and run from there. I'll just set this on the tripod and we'll start it up for you. Okay, everybody hold on to your hats. We'll wire it and fire it. Hold on.
Okay, my man.
I want to tell you that we just started it up, but we already did just a little before this. And then we broke it in for about 20 minutes on the engine stand. That's the way it is. Now when we put it together, put the body back on the car and wire it up, we shouldn't have to worry about settings and so on and so forth. We know everything works. And it's far better if anything's going to happen, whether it blows up or runs fine, it's better to do it like this than have to take it back out of the car with everything on it. So, there you go. 170, 454 with air and a 4-speed in it, ready to be taken over to Eckler's for the October reunion and displayed there. And then the body will go back on at the end of October. We'll get it painted and the car will be up for sale at Cypress Gardens. Well, I guess it's Disney World now. Signing off.
Load up.